evening, everybody. It is July 9th. We're in the first weekend of Stampede. God help us all. We're not going to be talking very much about that, though, tonight. We got a lot of other stuff to talk about. Welcome to another live episode of The Breakdown. You're listening to the podcast version or the recorded version, in which case it's not live for you. We go live Sundays at 8, though. So, if you want to hang out with us at one of those times, that's totally cool. But in the meantime, and in between time, I'm your host, Dave Pike. We got a lot to talk about tonight because even though it's Stampede, and that is typically the time of year when all of the politicians from all of the places come to Calgary to try to demonstrate that they maybe or maybe not know how to flip pancakes and maybe or maybe not bought some new shirts, maybe or maybe not bought some new cowboy boots. Usually that's a time where there's not a lot going on in politics, but nonetheless, this week we had a lot of things going on. We're going to start with some local events that happened here in Calgary again, unfortunately. And I say unfortunately because I am talking about the let's go with protests, I guess, that have been going on for a couple of weeks now. Now, these are protests that are ostensibly being billed as being organized by members of the Muslim community, although there's been a lot of people who have been very quick to point out, yeah, well, that's not us, though. That's those guys. And we're going to talk about that just a sec. But there have been rolling protests that have been going on. The claim is that these protests have been going on because these people are worried about gender ideology being taught in their kids. This is one of the posters that they've been circulating on social media, and allegedly in the real world too. They actually paid for paper and ink for some of these. We haven't seen any copies, so do with that what you will. But what are they upset about? Well, let's go right to the poster. Join us in a peaceful protest this Friday, July 7th, to protect our freedom of choice and protest against the introduction of gender ideology in public school curriculums. Let's all say in one voice that is our right as parents to raise and educate our children according to our own beliefs and values. Which in and of itself sounds kind of benign. Like, there's questions about public schools, there's questions about charter schools, there's public questions about religious schools. All of that could be a nuanced discussion. But it doesn't. It sounds like what these people are saying is they want to be able to have a voice in how their children are educated. Now, when it comes to the broad term of gender ideology, it gets complicated real quick because there's some things that are just matters of, I don't know, settled science that are some of the things that these folks are taking issue with. There's some of these things that they claim are happening in schools that are maybe happening in schools in other countries, but they're not happening here, and they're certainly not happening in Alberta. But that's not, at the end of the day, let's be honest, that's not what it's really about. And one of the questions that they asked at the rally on Friday was, and this is a quote from the Facebook page, "Where is our faith-based leaders? Yes, where are they?" And then they had a full speech, which we're absolutely not going to play here. We're not actually going to play any video from this protest because there's nothing really redeeming that was said in the video that we've seen. But they're asking the question, hey, where are all the faith-based leaders? And the answer is pretty straightforward. They want absolutely nothing to do with this shit show. Because not only are they grossly misrepresenting, the organizers of these protests, grossly misrepresenting what these protests are actually about, what they're actually for, but they're polarizing and weaponizing things that maybe they shouldn't be doing. Now, you might be asking, what kind of things could they possibly be weaponizing? They're just there to protect the kids. It's not like they're using kids as pawns to advance a political ideology that has nothing to do with the Alberta-based curriculum. It's not like anything like that. They certainly don't have kids waving "fuck Trudeau." Oh, wait, they do. At the protest on Friday, they got two kids to stand up and wave the "fuck Trudeau" flags that have the little maple leaf instead of the U word, so it's not really profanity. They had these kids standing up in front of the crowd of, I think there might have been a whole 30 people there, waving not flags about curriculum, not flags about gender, Not the pride flag, not the straight pride flag, not anything to do with what the topic, I guess, of the protest was. They had kids that they were weaponizing against the prime minister. Now, you can either like or not like the prime minister one way or the other. That's fine. But if you're going to say, we don't want kids to be exposed to hateful speech, we don't want kids to be exposed to polarizing politics, to prop kids up at the front of a crowd and have them waving those flags, you're doing worse than the thing that you're accusing the other people of doing. The people who are hosting these protests aren't hosting these protests because they're worried about gender ideology in schools. They're trying to get attention for themselves. They're trying to weaponize politics. And worst of all, they're weaponizing kids. Again, for the cheap seats, a quick reminder: Justin Trudeau, the federal government, have nothing to do with curriculum development or implementation in the province of Alberta, full stop. There's absolutely no overlap between Justin Trudeau and the Alberta curriculum that, by the way, was designed, redesigned, and implemented by the UCP. The only reason to have those flags out there is because you're trying to politicize a thing that you really shouldn't be politicizing at all. And like I said, it's absolutely appalling that they're not only using kids as weapons, saying, oh, we're just trying to protect the kids, but they're also literally politicizing these kids and having them wave these flags. But moving on from there, there's been some other activities over the last little while. And one of the big ones that we got to talk about has to be the port strike in BC. Now, there's a whole lot of layers to this that are a lot of fun to unpack, but there's also some pieces that are critically relevant to some of the industries that exist in Alberta. So one of the things that we saw, Danielle Smith came out with a tweet where she said this past weekend, 7,400 workers began strike action across the ports of British Columbia, immediately disrupting Canadian and global supply chains. This strike action has the potential to cause substantial economic harm on families and businesses across Canada, including here in Alberta. Our government is monitoring the situation and echoes the concerns of various business groups on the negative impact this will have on the Canadian economy. Danielle Smith and the UCP don't like it when people mess with borders unless they drive trucks and also have the same flags that we just talked about in our first story. It's kind of weird like that, where, you know, we saw Danielle Smith calling the folks who did the blockade at Coots heroes. She allowed one of them to be invited, more than one of them, to be invited to the legislature for her first throat speech. Danielle Smith has made it very clear, hey, if you're doing it in the name of freedom, then we're all about blocking the borders. But if you do it in BC, well, now she's got grave and serious concerns about what it is exactly that you're up to. And it wasn't just Danielle Smith. We saw letters from a couple of ministers who expressed their concern. One of them, whom was in just the perfect little taste, Devin Dreeshen. They wrote to the federal government saying, "Whoa, you can't mess with the borders. We didn't see any pickup trucks. Those look like boats. You can't mess with the borders with boats. Only pickup trucks." I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that was the conversation. So it begs the question, what's going on? What's the deal with these border blockades? Not even border blockades. What's the deal with these strikes? Why is it happening? And there's three main issues that have led to these strikes. It's worth noting, as we're going to talk about in a second, that there's been some talks that have reopened. But there's three main issues that have caused this little situation to develop. The first one has to do with the different ports have been outsourcing more and more maintenance stuffs that happen at these ports. It's not necessarily the biggest one, though. The next one that they're deeply concerned about, and anybody who's been paying attention to the cost of living in BC, this should come as no surprise, has to do with the cost of living in BC, because the cost of living in BC only continues to go higher and higher and higher. You can't turn a newspaper or an online news website. You can't flip through it without seeing a story about, hey, there's this like garage shack that just sold in Vancouver for like $2.5 million because the real estate situation is so out of control over there. So cost of living is another one of the really big reasons why this strike has happened again. These are all employees who have said, hey, you know what? We're not able to make ends meet based on what you're paying us here. Maybe you could try, I don't know, paying us a little bit more while you're making all that money. And the employers have said, or we couldn't. Let's try that. But where this gets, and there's obviously some overlap that exists between, hey, there's people working in industries who aren't able to make ends meet anymore. There's some overlap between, let's say, BC and Alberta. Let's say folks who work in the shipping industry in BC and maybe the oil and gas industry here in Alberta. There's lots of folks that are having trouble making ends meet while oil and gas companies are pulling in record profits. But that's not the only place that the similarities exist, because one of the other big concerns is something called port automation. And this is where jobs that have historically been done by people are now being done by computer programs or robots or machines, all of that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of debate as to how the automation piece is going to work. But one of the big things that has been happening with the automation process is, instead of there being as many full-time jobs that provide security as there were in the past in other ports that have gone through this automation process, there's a lot more casual hours. There's a lot more part-time hours that exist. People have a harder time accessing benefits, which brings us right back to the cost of living argument. Now, one of the conversations that continues to exist in the province of Alberta around oil and gas is the fact that we've seen the same sort of automation happening. And we've seen more and more jobs get eliminated because of automation. So there's a lot of overlap here. And when you consider that, when we're talking about the cost of living, when we're talking about the automation processes, it kind of makes a bit of sense why Danielle Smith and the UCP would say, whoa, 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 we don't want people striking because of that kind of stuff. Because if they get away with that in other places, they might try to do something like that here. We definitely don't want to see that happen. But it's worth noting that these negotiations have been going on for quite some time. And in these workers' situations, the only way that they could get the attention of the employers to come back to the table and really think about, hey, maybe some of these things, maybe do need a bit of wiggle room on these things. One of the reasons why people argue there's a whole reason for having unions. One of the reasons why they do it is because, it kind of works. We saw just a couple of days ago, there was the announcement that there was labor negotiations that were resuming. And they were resuming because all of the workers said, hey, we're not going to play this game in the way that you want us to play it anymore. We're going to do some of the things that we're legally, by the way, allowed to do. And it worked. So that's what the whole port conversation, the whole strike thing is all about. There's rampant hypocrisy that we're seeing from not only Danielle Smith, but multiple other ministers as they say, whoa, don't mess with the borders unless you're driving pickup trucks and Justin Trudeau's the target. But there's also a lot of overlap potentially that exists between the type of industry and the type of job action that we're seeing and the oil and gas industry here in Alberta. One of the other things that definitely made the headlines this week had to do with the Manning Report. So for those of you that don't remember, one of the things that Danielle Smith campaigned on with her leadership race was she said, you know what, this COVID thing, man, we got so much wrong. lives, livelihoods, the most discriminated against. It was all so very tragic. There should have been something more that we could have done to prevent it. If I get elected as the UCP leader and I become the premier of Alberta, I'm going to have a commission. We're going to have a panel that's going to find out what are the things that we could have done to make the whole COVID experience a little bit easier on everyone, which is a wild thing to say when you remember we're talking about a pandemic. This is a natural disaster on a global scale. When we start to get into that, well, how could we have made it a little bit less inconvenient? That's a pretty wild position to take. But even more wild is who she chose to put together to do the panel report. None other than her good old friend, Preston Reform Manning. Now, Preston Manning has had some opinions about the whole COVID situation. And before Danielle Smith brought him in to run her panel, her inquiry, he was actually trying to put together his own. And he'd actually written a preliminary report, I guess we could call it. We like to refer to it as fan fiction here, because what he produced was a fictional work, Hunger Games style, describing here's what a COVID panel could look like, and here's how it could lead to massive political change in a better world as all of the freedom fighters join together to form one big party, and we take over Canada forever, and it'll be delightful. This, I'm not even joking. You can read this thing. It is a conservative dystopian train wreck of the worst quality. But he produced this whole thing, and Danielle Smith said, hey, you know what? How about instead of you having to do all the fundraising to put together your national panel, what if I just gave you $2 million and you could keep $250,000 for yourself? How would that go for you, Preston? And unsurprisingly, Preston said yes. But there's been some problems. The first one is the panel they were supposed to submit their final report by the end of June. Now, apparently that's happened, but the public isn't going to get to see this public inquiry until November. They might be wondering what is it about this report that's going to take 4, 5, 6 months to sort out the typos and get rid of the Orwellian ending, fictional Orwellian ending that Mr. Manning may or may not have added to this thing. We don't know. We didn't get to read it. But there are some things that we do know. There are some reporters have been doing some really, really impressive work keeping on top of this. And one of them is a reporter named Matthew Black. He's done a series of FOIPs, Freedom of Information Act requests, where he has asked about, hey, so what were the responses that you got? One of the things that this panel did very early on is they said, hey, you know what? Let's throw it out to the public. Hey, public, what would you have liked about your COVID experience? Should there have been more strawberries or perhaps a better fruit bar? What would have really done it for you to make your COVID experience the best possible COVID experience that it could have had? And the results weren't probably what Danielle Smith and Preston Manning wanted to see. Overwhelmingly, the most common results that we saw had to do with an emphasis on expertise. They wanted the decisions made during a pandemic to be made by people who were qualified to make them. They didn't politicians showing up and taking over press conferences. They didn't want politicians making decisions that they had no background or expertise in. They wanted more emphasis on expertise. 17.1% of all responses said we want more emphasis on expertise. Next in the category, 16.6% wanted greater powers and independence for the chief medical officer of health. One of the big criticisms that came all the way through the pandemic had to do with the perception, and there were some reports that seemed to argue that the perception was more than a little bit real, but the perception that maybe Jason Kenney was kind of telling Dr. Dina Henshaw what she was going to do, when she was going to do it, how she was going to say it, all those things. And certainly that's a sentiment that Dr. Henshaw echoed, where she said, well, it's my job to advise. I'm not the decision man. I'm not the decider. As we get down into the smaller numbers, that's where we start to see some of the more extreme views. 15.2%, which is again less than half of the first two categories. They were against public health measures. There was dissent. 6.8 against vaccination. This is my favorite category, though. 6.8% of the responses to the Manning panel were incoherent. They looked at 6.8% of the responses, and they couldn't figure out what it was that these people were talking about. That just makes my day in about every way that a day can be made, I think. It's going to be fascinating to see what comes out of the Manning Report come November, right before the Christmas holidays. It's almost as if they're trying to bury it because it's not going to give them what they wanted. It's so strange. Moving on from there, though, starting to get into some of the bigger conversations of the evening. We saw a couple announcements from Danielle Smith this week. She announced that she was going to be, the Alberta government was signing an agreement to bring a recovery center to both Tsuut'ina and the Siksika nations. This is kind of a big deal, and it comes on the heels of a profoundly tragic news story. Now, that profoundly tragic news story that I'm talking about is one that has to do with the First Nations life expectancy. This was done by Danielle Paradis. It's always those. I'm trying. We'll go with Danielle Paradis because I feel like the S is silent. It's probably one of those S's that's just wanting me to think it's silent. That's going to come from me. She's a well-respected, longtime reporter on First Nations and Indigenous issues, and she put together a story where she talks about the fact that First Nations life expectancy has actually dropped significantly. I'm going to read a portion of the story here. Between 2015 and 2021, the life expectancy dropped a shocking 7 years for First Nations men and women living in Alberta, due in part to drug poisoning deaths. In 2015, the average life expectancy for a First Nations man was 67. Today, that has dropped to 60. For a First Nations woman, it's gone from 73 in 2015 to 66 in 2021. And for context, the life expectancy of a non-First Nations man is 79. For a non-First Nations woman, it's 84. I want to just say that with those First Nations numbers in there. A non-First Nations man life expectancy is 79. Today, for First Nations folks, it's 60 for First Nations men. For non-First Nations women, it's 84. For First Nations women, it's 66. Now, this story is an important one for more than a couple of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is one of the biggest sources of information. One of the person who provides the most color and context on the story is none other than Dr. Esther Tailfeathers. Dr. Esther Tailfeathers is the physician who was responsible for running the Indigenous Wellness Corps with Alberta Health Services for a good chunk of time until she tried to hire Dr. Dina Henshaw to work in the public health area of the Indigenous Wellness Corps. Dr. Henshaw was hired after the whole memo debacle, where there was some question as to whether or not the memo was authentic for a little while. And then somebody at the very, very tippy top of the chain of command, we're not sure who, that information hasn't been public. We haven't got our FOIP requests back yet. Somebody made the decision, you know what? Maybe we just don't hire her then. Dr. Esther Tailfeathers and another high-ranking AHS official resigned over that overreach. We've seen physicians saying that this is a profoundly dangerous precedent for the government and whoever made the decision to set, because it basically says, hey, you know what? If the government doesn't like you, you're not going to get the jobs. So there's that. But it's on the tails of this story that that we saw the UCP and Danielle Smith make the announcement that they were going to be creating these new recovery centers that were going to be informed both by conventional medicine as well as traditional methods to the different areas. 75 new beds in each of those. But that's not The only bad news that came in regards to the conversation of opiate overdoses and all of the rest of that stuff. Um, there was more record numbers that came out as well from Alberta Health Services in regards to overdoses and the number of ambulance trips in Alberta. And it's bad. I mean, we talked about this on last week's episode. When you take a look at the month, it was really bad. We were setting record numbers, and it turns out, if you take a look on the far right end of the screen, it's just getting so much worse. And there's a lot of different reasons why this is happening, but one of the biggest ones has to be the whole conversation around the question of safe supply. One of the big stories that's finally starting to get a little bit of traction is the reality that it's not so much the opiates that are killing people, because there's tools that have been put in place, like Narcan kits, to help prevent people from dying from opioid overdoses. But we're now seeing more and more stuff that's getting mixed into the supply. They're talking about sedatives like xylazine that are making their way into the mix as well. But despite all of that, Danielle Smith absolutely refuses to even consider the possibility of looking at safe supply. Now, on last weekend's episode, we did a whole big segment where we talked about how wrong it is for Danielle Smith to say there's no such thing as safe opiates, because it turns out there are. They get used in hospitals literally every day. But Danielle Smith refuses to even look at it. And she's very, very clear about who's going to be running these recovery centers, who's running the game on when it comes to the province's strategy. One of the quotes that we saw this week circulating was, "This is the reason why a recovery-oriented system of care is not being led by Alberta Health Services. Our recovery-oriented system of care is being led by the Ministry of Mental Health and Addiction. It's being led as well out of my office by my chief of staff, who she claims is an expert in recovery-oriented system of care approach." Now, let's be clear. I can't believe that she continues to flog this idea that her chief of staff is an expert in recovery-oriented system of care. She's talking about her chief of staff, Marshall Smith. Marshall Smith has a complex and colorful history. He spent years working in government. He developed a substance abuse issue. He ended up going into treatment after spending some time being homeless. And then he started running recovery centers. And if it had just been he was the administrator, and again, administrator, he wasn't the person doing the treatment, he was the administrator of those facilities. So it's kind of like there's a manager at the Subway. They're not usually the one making the sandwiches. They're just the ones managing payroll and all of the utilities and all of that kind of stuff. They're not the sandwich artists. If he had just been an exemplary manager, then it probably wouldn't be nearly as controversial as it is. But there's been multiple media reports about allegations having to do with Marshall Smith allegedly utilizing people who were working in recovery and forcing them, in effect, to work on political campaigns, to do phone calling. So not only is he not an expert, certainly not a medical expert, he's not a physician, but his history is a little, let's go with, problematic, at the very least because of the allegations that have been levied against him. Dandy Williams is not a mental health or addictions expert by any stretch of the imagination, but he's the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions. Dandy Williams is also the guy who brought us conscious rights in his first year as an MLA. Dandy Williams is also one of the people who's very much against women's access to health care. He's pro-life, anti-abortion. So he's not an ideologue at all. That was sarcasm. He's totally an ideologue. But that's who's running the show. We've got an administrator of a couple of addiction centers who had accusations of exploiting the people who were in treatment there. And we've got Dandy Williams, who likes to drink beer in the legislature. And I'm not even joking about that. There's video. We just didn't pull it. But while these press conferences were going on and Danielle Smith was answering her questions about the recovery center, we had, it hurts every time I have to do this. It hurts me on the inside. I remember growing up, there was a columnist. Can't really call him a journalist, but he was a columnist. He had gusto. He had a really cool hat. He kind of fit every cliche that you can imagine about that intrepid reporter. Ran for mayor once, and then it seems like he just sold out all the way. Potentially related or unrelated to that, I'm not sure. We're going to play you this little video clip here.
Post media. Premier, on the CBC story, as it was happening, as it was being reported, as it was being written and broadcast day after day after day, at that time, in real time, can you describe for us how you were feeling then, back then, as this was going on? Not how you're feeling now. Now you're feeling vindicated, but how did you feel when you were in the middle of the hurricane?
Well, I can tell you it wasn't just me. I mean, the CBC was defaming me. They were defaming my Premier's office staff. They were defaming the independent members of the nonpartisan public service. They were defaming the Crown prosecutors. They were causing lack of trust in the process of administration of justice. They're creating turmoil in our caucus. And they were, and I think they ultimately created distrust in the media, because the general public looked to the media as a trusted source, yes, to hold government to account, but also to be printing information that's true. And they didn't in this case, and I wish that they had corrected the record more quickly, but at least they have, and that's why I feel vindicated today.
Oh, there's so much to unpack here. So much to unpack here. But Rick Bell threw the softball. Danielle Smith, the CBC, they retracted things. You got to be feeling good about yourself. You got to be feeling vindicated. Smith got to do the, I was the victim here. It's really unfortunate. And now nobody should trust the media. It was a train wreck. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the CBC story that came out on January 19th of this year. Now, there's a lot going on here, and we're going to try to make some sense of some of it. Back in January, CBC published a story where they said they hadn't seen any of the actual copies of the emails, but they were told by people on the inside who they believed to be extremely reliable sources that they had authenticated. These people ostensibly told the CBC that there were emails, or there was some form of communication that occurred between the Premier's office and Crown prosecutors to try to pressure Crown prosecutors to drop charges or to minimize charges against people who were involved in COVID-type situations. Now, let's remember, it's not just those folks with the CBC article that said that Smith allegedly did those things. Smith said it herself, no less than 3 times on video. Once on audio. She was very, very clear. She talks to Crown prosecutors all the time. She's been asking Crown prosecutors these questions. So it's not as if CBC was pulling this stuff out of left field entirely. Danielle Smith is on video. We could pull the videos up right now. Danielle Smith is on video where she said, I talk to Crown prosecutors. I constantly ask them if they should be pursuing these cases. Now, Danielle Smith tried to diffuse that at the time by saying, oh, well, but you know what? I spoke imprecisely. And then everyone went, that's pretty imprecise, pretty consistently. Hopefully, either you or one of your staff would say, hey, maybe don't say that you're breaking the law on camera. That might be a great way to spend your weekend, practicing not saying that you're breaking the law on camera. But it wasn't just that, because we also saw the leak that came out of the whole phone conversation between Danielle Smith and Artur Pawlowski, where she expressed her great admiration for the work he's done This is, by the way, the same pastor who said that it was the gays that caused the floods in Calgary in 2013. It was it was God's punishment for all of the gays. That's the person who Danielle Smith expressed great admiration for. But she also said, you know what? I'm going to talk to the people. I'm going to see what I can work out for you here, Arthur. I'll get back to you. These are all things that happened. There's no question as to whether or not Danielle Smith said that she was talking to Crown prosecutors regularly because she said it. There's no question as to whether or not she said she was going to look into Arthur's case because she said it to Arthur and the whole thing's on video. There's no question as to whether or not she said these things because she did. But there was an ethics commissioner investigation, in part because of some of the things that were Danielle Smith had said publicly, but also in part because of the CBC story. Well, we saw this week, CBC issued a rather long statement. An earlier version of this story, published on January 19th, 2023, referred to emails allegedly sent by a staffer in Danielle Smith's office to the Alberta Crown Prosecutor Service. Based on testimonies by confidential sources, CBC News at the time described those emails as challenging prosecutors' assessments and direction on cases stemming from the Coots border blockades and protest. An editor's note was added the following day to specify that CBC News had not seen the emails. On May 18th, 2023, Alberta Ethics Commissioner Margaret Trussler released a report that included an investigation of an allegation published by the CBC that a member of the Premier's staff emailed a Crown prosecutor about a case before the courts. Trussler reported that she found no evidence of such an email, adding that she can only come to the conclusion, based on the evidence that she has, that no Crown prosecutor was emailed directly about any of these cases. At the same time, Trussler found that Danielle Smith had contravened the Conflict of Interest Act in an interaction with the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General in relation to the Coots charges, for which Smith has since apologized. The kind of was me editorializing there. After the Ethics Commissioner's report was released, CBC reviewed its journalism and re-interviewed a number of sources and parties to the matter. Confronted with the Commissioner's report, our sources have insisted that Crown prosecutors felt political pressure regarding the Coots cases, but they were not able to confirm that the emails they originally described were sent directly from the Premier's office to the Crown. As such, we have updated the story and related pieces, removing references to direct contact between the Premier's office and prosecutors, which the Premier has vehemently denied. CBC regrets reporting direct contact by email. Now, let's take a step back for a second because, again, there's some things that we have to deal with. What that retraction says is that CBC has no proof that there was contact by email. Fair enough. In the original story, they said that there were emails. Here's where it gets complicated. This is not, first of all, a vindication of Smith. We're going to be really clear about that in just a minute. But more to the point, as we've said on the show, and as many other pundits have noted, there's lots of other methods of communication that get used. Charles Rusnell did a full piece where he talked about the fact that through freedom of information requests, as well as talking to people who were inside of the UCP government figured out very early on that it was better to not use the standard and accepted and FOIPable methods of communication, and instead there was a whole program that existed in regards to how to use programs like Slack or WhatsApp and how to delete things so there was no track. So the first problem that we have to deal with here, the very first problem that we have to deal with, is that we're at a point where we literally have no way of knowing whether or not there was any communication, because we have a government that actively engages in subterfuge to try to hide their tracks. That's documented. So we have no way of knowing whether or not there was any kind of communication that wasn't explicitly government emails. And the fact that CBC seems to be very, very clear about emails in their reversal lends itself to the possibility that maybe there was other forms of communication that were going on. It certainly wouldn't be off-brand Danielle Smith maintains her subscription-based locals page to this day. So we have a government where we know we can't trust how they're communicating with each other. And that's a real problem. Whether or not there was any communication that occurred between anybody involved with Danielle Smith's office and the Crown Prosecutor's office using any sort of non-governmental email, that's almost secondary to the fact that we know we have a government that's doing its best to pull the wool over everybody's eyes. That's a real problem. But the bigger problem that we have to deal with is that we have people who are running around making claims that, hey, you know what? Oh, you've been vindicated, Danielle. Boy, that's just got to feel so very, very good. And it's not just people showing up at press conferences. Let's remember one of the interviews wherein Danielle Smith bragged casually, leaning back in her chair, about the fact she's talking to Crown prosecutors all the time. She's got this covered. Don't you worry, Ezra. Was in an interview that she did, a year-end interview that she did with the Rebel Media with Ezra Levant. One would think that maybe that wouldn't be the first go-to or the second go-to for the Premier of Alberta to have this conversation after she got herself into hot water last time. As we saw this week, one would be wrong.
Never, maybe since the time of Stockwell Day, seen an assassination attempt through media like I have.
Yep.
The CBC in January said that you or your office had sent emails
Yep.
threatening and pressuring prosecutors to drop certain prosecutions. They swore on a stack of Bibles
Yep.
it was real. The government, the civil service, the neutral civil service examined more than 1 million emails. None were found.
Mhm.
Every prosecutor, every single one testified they had not received such an email.
Mhm.
Everyone in your office testified. And a former judge, Margaret Trussler, said there was no evidence at all. This was all before the election. For 6 months, the CBC held on to that lie.
Mhm.
Only yesterday, July 5th, did the CBC write a grudging correction that those emails never existed.
Mhm.
How do you deal with wicked liars like that? I'm full of rage for that's not journalism. They were your chief opponent. I put it to you, they were your chief opponent.
Well, and it's frustrating too, because what do they get? $1.5 billion from the federal government. And so they have the ability to do those kinds of stories, stick with them as long as they did, lie, and then, as you point out, grudgingly acknowledge that they lied and retract the story. I feel vindicated because at least we managed to get them to acknowledge that their story was just frankly untrue. It's
After
now
the election, that is election interference by a government agency run by Justin Trudeau. Tell me I'm wrong. Election
they
interference.
had an opportunity, and we tried to give them the opportunity to acknowledge, especially after we did the email review, that the emails didn't exist, and they chose not to.
Well, let me ask you a question. I remember when the CBC sued the Conservative Party of Canada. And if I recall, it was Andrew Scheer who was the leader at the time. And he still went on CBC shows.
Yeah.
And I thought, have you no self-respect? They're suing you and you're going on the show. So let me ask you, Premier Smith. The CBC lied about you for 6 months. A wicked lie that did great damage to the reputation of prosecutors in Alberta. Claimed that they were corrupt in some way.
Yeah.
They aimed for you. They also had collateral damage in the Justice Department. Do you think you should still deal with the CBC as a news agency, or do you think you should deal with them as a kind of Trudeau super PAC?
Well, they certainly smeared everyone. They smeared me. They smeared all my office staff. They smeared the Independent Public Service. They smeared the Crown prosecutors. And they gave ammunition to my opponents to smear me some more. I mean, the NDP should also apologize because the NDP also went on.
Still going to do sit-downs with the CBC? Like they came to kill you.
I'll have to talk to my team about that.
Yeah, I mean...
You know what I've done? I will take their questions in a mediated forum because I do a lot of press conferences, and I think that's fair because I want to be the type of person who will take questions from everyone. But it is, I mean, I do have to consider if they aren't prepared to be fair, accurate, and balanced. If they're really only interviewing me in order to get ammunition to be the official opposition, I'm going to have to keep that in mind every time I answer a question from the CBC.
There's so much there. I know I keep saying that tonight, but there's so much there. Now, we're not going to play the clip from because it's not really germane to this conversation, but we're not going to play the clip where Smith talked about making Alberta an island, which is, I wish I was joking, but I'm not. You can find that on our Twitter, on our Instagram, and on our threads, because we're there now too. All the cool kids are, I'm told. But getting back to this clip, Ezra Levant started out. The only thing, personally, of merit that Ezra Levant said in that particular screed, I believe, my own personal opinion without any evidence whatsoever, other than just objectivity. The only thing that he said that was of any value is, how do you deal with wicked liars like that? Because so much of what that clip was not only straight up bullshit, but it was a deliberate and willful attempt to mislead people into believing that Danielle Smith had somehow been vindicated. He called it an assassination attempt by the CBC, which right out of the gates, we're ascribing motive. By calling it an assassination attempt, you're not just saying, hey, you know what, the CBC screwed up. It's not like the rebels ever gotten any facts wrong. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But by calling it an assassination attempt, you're putting motive to that, saying that this wasn't just a mistake in reporting. This just wasn't just a mistake in phrasing. This wasn't maybe just a mistake in the story. This was a willful and deliberate attempt by the CBC to take Danielle Smith out. He says the Smith story was untrue. That's not true. We're going to come back to the comments that Margaret Trussler made in regards to the story about Smith being untrue, because for Ezra Levant and the rebel media, and more importantly, for Danielle Smith to allow him to present it as in, she's been vindicated. Not only is it a completely inaccurate portrayal of what happened, but let's remember that Danielle Smith had to apologize in the legislature just recently. There's nothing that speaks to the sincerity of an apology like completely gaslighting the entire province about what it was that you had to apologize for. But where it gets really insidious is the comments about CBC and the federal funding. Now, yes, the CBC really receives federal funding. The CBC is also an arm's length organization. Not arm's length in like the UCP, AHS kind of way, but legitimately an arm's length organization. The federal government, whether it's conservative or liberal or whatever, has no influence on how the CBC does their stories. That's built into legislation. It's built into the rules. But it's also worth noting, CBC isn't the only people that get government funding. Post Media gets gobs of government money. There's lots of media organizations that get government money. And there's a good reason for that. Good investigative journalism doesn't sell beer. It's hard to make money to pay for all of the things doing real journalism. So it's subsidized by the government, like many other essential services are subsidized by the government. And there's nothing wrong with that, because as we've said many times on this show before, the foundation of any healthy democracy is a well-informed electorate. And you need objective journalism that does in-depth investigative stories, that is willing to own their mistakes and say, hey, we've got to issue this retraction because it appears like some of the wording that we used may not have been 100% accurate. Let's be clear. The CBC has taken more responsibility for their role in this whole thing than the Premier of Alberta has. She's government funded too, by the way. But the whole implication that Justin Trudeau has some sort of super PAC availability with the CBC, and that maybe, this was maybe the CBC was just attacking you because Justin said so. Now, obviously, Ezra didn't say those words, but he did say, should we just treat the CBC like it's a Justin Trudeau super PAC? They did try to assassinate you. Justin Trudeau does have control out of them. Any idiot can draw the lines together of the picture that Ezra's trying to paint there without actually saying it. And at no point does Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, say, hey, I think you might be crossing a couple of lines there. I think maybe that's not appropriate. Nowhere in that story did the CBC allege that Crown prosecutors were corrupt. Nowhere in that story did CBC say, you know what, Danielle Smith's office, maybe they tried to reach out to the Crown prosecutors, and then the Crown prosecutors just bent over and did exactly what Danielle Smith said for them to do. That's simply not what was, is, or ever has been in that story. That's a fantasy. And it's a fantasy, one might speculate, that Ezra is spinning because maybe he gets some more subscribers out of this. Maybe people go, oh, you know what? The Rebel, they don't take any money from the government. We should give them money to lie to us, I guess. Because saying that the CBC called the Crown prosecutors corrupt is a lie. Also saying that Margaret Trussler said that the story was untrue is also a lie. Let's take a look. Just go down memory lane a little bit and take a look at what it was that the ethics commissioner, Margaret Trussler, actually said. What she actually said was, speaking to an attorney general about a specific ongoing criminal case, in the way that Premier Smith did on the call with Minister Shandro is not acceptable. Just as was the case with Prime Minister Trudeau in the SNC-Lavalin case, Premier Smith was the only person who, by virtue of her position, could clearly exert influence over the Attorney General and had the power to remove Minister Shandro from his position as Minister of Justice and Attorney General. I believe that Minister Shandro must have felt considerable pressure and concern for his tenure as minister as a result of the call. In the whole scheme of things, it is a threat to democracy to interfere with the administration of justice. It is the first step towards the type of judicial system often found in a non-democratic or pseudo-democratic country where members of and friends of those in power are shielded from prosecution or are acquitted by the courts on the instructions of those in power. As well, those opposing the government face trumped-up charges and are convicted based on political instructions to the judiciary, which slavishly follows the government agenda in order to keep their positions. This independence is a cornerstone of any democratic society, and democracy will fail without it. So let's be super clear. Those were all Margaret Trussler's words. I don't know who reads those paragraphs and go, it's a vindication. Danielle Smith did nothing wrong, except for, try to corrode the foundations of democracy. It's also probably worth noting the conversation that Danielle Smith with Tyler Shandro didn't happen via email. The conversation that got Danielle Smith in so much trouble because she was explicit that she wanted the Archer-Pulaski problem to go away because she was concerned about the optics. That conversation didn't happen via email. That conversation happened over the phone. But that's not all that the ethics commissioner had to say. In my opinion, Premier Smith contravened Section 3 of the Conflict of Interest Act in her interaction with the Minister of Justice and Attorney General in relation to the criminal charges Mr. Pulowski was facing. At this point, I make no recommendations with respect to sanctions against the Premier for consideration of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, but reserve the right to make recommendations once the Legislative Assembly is back in session. She also then made a recommendation, I'm going to paraphrase here, that all MLAs and newly elected school officials have to go, newly elected government officials have to go to school for a remedial course in here's how government works. You've a run for the job. You've got it now. Let's talk about what the rules are. Maybe don't try to use the mechanisms of government to your own personal gain. Let's be really clear here. Imagine, if you will, somebody makes plans They're going to go rob a bank. And they drive to the bank. And they maybe park in the handicapped spot at the bank. Maybe they got a couple tires crossing over into the handicapped spot before they go into the bank and rob it. And they go into the bank and they rob it. And they get all the money. And they do it on video. And then they brag about it to their social media networks that I robbed the bank. I got all the money. Ha ha. And then the police come and charge them. And not only do the police come and say, hey, you know what? Yeah, you robbed the bank. You're on video admitting you robbed the bank. Probably shouldn't have robbed the bank, but also we're going to give you a ticket for that parking job that you did out there because one of our officers he heard that when you parked initially before you robbed the bank, you'd actually parked in the handicap stall. This is what we were told. So we're going to give you a ticket for the handicap stall parking job because you're not handicapped, so you don't get to just park in that stall because. So we're going to charge you with the handicap parking stall violation, and we're going to charge you with robbing the friggin' bank. And then it comes out, oh, you know what? There's no actual proof that this person parked in the handicap stall. And the bank robber, after having been convicted by the judge for robbing the bank, after having admitted to robbing the bank robber then goes, you know what? I'm free on the parking ticket. I'm vindicated, everybody. Because that's what the Premier of Alberta is doing. And to look at the orchestration that's going on in regards to getting the message out there that Danielle Smith's been vindicated is not only just not accurate. The CBC got one part of the story wrong. The ethics commissioner found that Danielle Smith broke the law. She violated the Conflict of Interests Act, and she did so to her own advantage. She's trying to. That's the facts. That remains true. That's why Danielle Smith had to apologize in the legislature. But now, just because CBC got one element of the story that they've retracted, Danielle Smith is feeling vindicated. She's feeling great. It just proves that the CBC, they're not fair, they're not balanced. And, I'm not going to correct you at all, Ezra, about the Trudeau government launching this assassination attempt against me. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's embarrassing. And the unfortunate thing is that there are a lot of people who are only going to hear Danielle Smith saying, I've been vindicated. And they won't realize she got vindicated for the parking job. She still robbed the bank. And we got a couple of loose ends we're going to try to tie up because that got heavy. So we have a couple of lighter little fun stories that we're gonna try to get through real quick. One of them has to do with the mandate letters. The government said no more mandates, has been handing out mandate letters. I stole that joke from the Twitter machine. But one of the things that happened when Danielle Smith had her government previously is she issued mandate letters to all of her ministers and said, here's your job. Here's what you're supposed to do. And you would expect that all of the ministries being of equal importance, especially given that we saw these major announcements in regards to treatment and the opioid stuffs that are going on in these new treatment centers, and we're absolutely not going to do safe supply. You would think that might be maybe a ministry that would get its mandate letter, but it is Stampede Week, and Danielle Smith has been busy. So far, there's only two. The first one we saw come out on the 5th, and this one went to the Honorable Matt Jones, who is the Minister of Jobs, Economy and Trade. And it's pretty banal, honestly, as mandate letters go. There's no setup an Alberta police force. There's none of that. But then just a couple of days ago, we got another one. And this one is for R.J. Sigurdsson, who's the Ministry of Agriculture and Innovation. And there was one thing that kind of jumped out, because this is this is very clearly a little bit of a, let's call it a middle finger towards the federal government. And that has to do with exploring ways to encourage increased nitrogen production in our petrochemical sector to reduce costs and improve availability of fertilizer for Alberta's farmers. Now, you might remember just a little while ago, there was a great big furor over a proposed program by the federal government where they were looking for farmers to voluntarily um, decrease the use of nitrogen based fertilizers. So there's a couple of comments that we wanted to highlight from the report that the federal government put out, because at the time the federal government was very clear, hey, we're going to look at ways to decrease nitrogen fertilizers because they're bad. They make a lot of carbon problems. Just how bad? Well, there's a little graph right here that seems to spell it out pretty clearly, because this is from their report, Direct and Indirect Emissions from Synthetic Nitrogen Fertilizer Applications 2005 to 2020. And not only do you see that there is a significant increase over time, but there's a significant increase in direct emissions. Now, obviously, we need food. That's an important thing. And obviously, we don't want to see farmers not being able to make food. But there's a couple of quotes that are important to take into context from the overall report. So this one comes from Fertilizer Canada. Canada can raise production levels with aggressive but realistic adoption rates of 4R and management practices and substantially reduce fertilizer N2O emissions by 1.6, by 14%. This substantial reduction can be realized with growth and production of key grains and oilseeds, the maintenance or improvement of crop-based economy, and reduction in carbon intensity. So that's from Fertilizer Canada. Those folks have got a little bit of a stake in the game. They're saying it can be reduced. Well, this is from Farmers for Climate Solution, because as it turns out, there's a lot of farmers that actually do care about the climate because it kind of directly impacts their ability to do their jobs. While many farmers currently apply nitrogen at agronomic rates, the research clearly shows that the average Canadian farmer could reduce their N application rates by 10 to 30% and experience very small yield losses or no yield loss at all. So there's some wiggle room to decrease the nitrogen that we're using for the farming, is the Coles notes. But here we have the mandate letter that says, well, how about we just start using more and more nitrogen? Because reasons, I guess. Well, we got a couple of other fun little moments that we want to talk about. Some directly related to the Alberta politics, some directly not. One of them comes to us from the NDP. Everybody's writing letters these days. Everybody's writing all of the letters to all of the people because that's the fun thing to do, I guess. We saw this letter come from the Alberta NDP critic for small business, where he wrote directly to Chrystia Freeland, where he's talking about in effect, the COVID loans that were given to small businesses during the pandemic, asking for an extension, the CBA repayment deadline. Now, this is interesting for a couple of different reasons. The first reason is he's an opposition critic. One would think that if you were trying to, I don't know, play politics with it, maybe you would write to the minister responsible for that area first, one of the ones who maybe got his mandate letters this week, and you would say, hey, you really need to petition the federal government to do this stuff because there's all these small businesses, they're about to get screwed. Let's work together. Let's be collaborative. You're the government. You're the one in charge of representing Albertans on this file. You were elected to do so. Why don't we see if maybe you write yourself a letter? And then when the UCP doesn't write that letter or they don't advocate on the issue, then you can turn around and say, hey, you know what? We tried to take it to the UCP, but they're clearly not in the business of representing small businesses in Alberta. They're too busy answering to their corporate overloads or whatever narrative you want to try to spin with it. And then you write your letter. But no, we're gonna skip all of that. We're gonna go direct to the exercise in profile building or attempt in profile building, and we're gonna publicly release this letter ourselves with all of the no authority and weight that it carries. See, we can make jokes about the NDP too. And then there's Mr. Parker. So we talked last week about David Parker, and we talked about Take Back Alberta, and we talked about how I was very, very sad because I wasn't going to get to say the name Marco Van Hugenbos with the frequency that I've enjoyed for the last year and a half, 2 years, because Marco was the chief, the CFO. He was the money bags guy for David Parker and Take Back Alberta. And after David Parker went after the UCP president Cynthia Moore in a series of tweets that accused her of being tyrannical and many other bad things. Um, Marco did an interview with Don Braid where he said, "This is too much. Parker's gone too far. I can't." And we had a lot of fun last week on our episode where we talked about, hey, it's kind of neat, isn't it, that David Parker has become too extreme for Marco Van Hugenbos, who is one of the alleged organizers of the Coutts blockade. And it was really funny because you got a guy who's one of the alleged organizers for the Coutts blockade, and he's saying that David Parker is too extreme for him. So that's funny. It was fun. We enjoyed it for like a couple of days. And then Marco did this. He released this apology. "I'm sorry, David, please take me back" letter, where he said, "Over the course of the long weekend, I've had some time to reflect on the events of the past week, in particular the article written by Don Braid. In light of that, I wanted to share my thoughts. Politics can be passionate, and I can also be very persistent in my approach and in communication. While we work to achieve political objectives, we often let our differences as conservatives take precedence over the many values we align on. These differences are used to exploit the movement and create division. As conservatives, we are allowed to be adamant on our values, but we must remain both civil and respectful as we communicate and work to implement these values. David and I have had disagreements on many things in the past that are relevant to the many values that we both share. Our professional working relationship in TBA has ended, but I remain deeply committed to the values that TBA strives for and the conservative movement in this province. Earlier today, I called David Parker and apologized for my public comments last week. We had a brief discussion on our shared values, the conservative cause, and how we can continue to work together on those shared goals." I just, I can't with these guys anymore. It's just so ridiculous. It's so dysfunctional. It's fantastic. Um, that's our second to last. Hopefully, it gives you a little bit of a giggle story. But the tweet of the week, the one that we knew we had to end our roundup on this week before we open it up to the floor with the Twitter Spaces. So if there's anybody in the Twitter Spaces and you want to share some thoughts, you want to tell me what I got wrong, yeah, maybe you want to say something nice, or maybe you just want to offer up a big old fashioned stampede, yeehaw, as is the fashion. Um, then you could absolutely just go ahead and tap in a sec. But before we do, I almost want to call this like the tweet of, with Twitter ending, apparently, I don't know, we're going to be there till the lights go out, just because. But we're also on the new threads as well. We haven't figured out how to broadcast on that yet. I don't think they let you do that yet. If they do, we'll be broadcasting there too. But the it almost feels like the tweet of all time came just a couple of days ago. And this was a tweet that came from none other than Artur Pawlowski. "Breaking news. The Calgary police have issued a warrant for Nathaniel Pawlowski, the son of the persecuted pastor Artur Pawlowski, that is facing 10 years of imprisonment for delivering a sermon during the truck convoy." And went on with a bunch of other stuff. And then they got a picture of Nathan Pawlowski. I was Artur Pawlowski's kid. And I mean, I love that Arthur's speaking in the third person in regards to his Twitter account. But the reply from the Calgary police: "A check of our systems show no warrants, and we are unaware of any active investigations involving this individual." I know there's a lot of people who have concerns about policing, and there's for sure times where there's questions to be asked. But the Calgary police crushed it. They absolutely crushed it with this tweet. I'm gonna frame this. I may this may be my next shirt. I'm trying to decide. I don't know, but it's absolute gold. Anyways, that's the end of our roundup. Now we're gonna do the transition to the comments, the open mic. So if you are somebody who is on the Twitter Spaces and you have some thoughts that you want to share, all you have to do is click on the little microphone finger in the bottom left hand corner, and then you can tell me how I'm wrong. And I see we have a familiar name who's at the top of the list of speakers tonight. So I'm gonna open it up and welcome back to the show for the first time in a long time, none other than Politico and pundit Sarah Biggs. Sarah Biggs, what's going on tonight?
Hi.
How are you doing?
Oh, I'm in my best life.
Well, that's good. Best lives. Are you enjoying the stampede?
I am enjoying the hospital.
That's less fun than the stampede, I imagine. I mean,
It
I don't know.
keeps.
I try to avoid the stampede. I've been in Calgary long enough that it's like, oh, stay away from the radioactive place, but that's not great.
Well, it's when you do what I do, like during Stampede, especially like the big firm events and all that, is where you usually do your connections for the year, right? So we'll see when the doctors will be willing to let me out.
Well, there you go.
But I've been watching everything with such like a different eye for the past 3 weeks.
I can imagine.
I and David Parker, can we just not anymore?
That dude.
Fuck.
The Marco, like, I'm sorry, baby, please take me back.
Someone got a good spanking last week, and I was like, "Ooh, that one hurt." But no, I just wanted to say hi. But apparently us women voters will be voting conservative because Polyev went through puberty and decided to grow pecs.
Hey, I mean,
But I really want to know what shade of foundation he's using because I want to compare notes. I
see,
really do.
I'm kind of torn on the makeup thing, and I say this because, like, I don't have a problem with
No,
anyone wearing makeup. I feel like he could use some remedial lessons. Like I don't I've received a few DMs on the show where people have been like, "Oh, Nate, you look a little flushed. Maybe throw some foundation on before you go on." And it's like
yeah,
then I'd have to clean it up.
it's
Um,
overrated. But it's the hypocrisy, right? Saying that, Trudeau was getting all the votes because he was a good looking guy. And now they're trying to transform Podiev into that Dollarama version of Tom Cruise. And they are trying to blatantly fool us in daylight, make us believe that he's a changed man.
I just love the shirt. That was my favorite part. Was like he
Ugh,
got the makeup stain on the one shirt, and like again, I'm not going to give anyone grief about wearing makeup, but
no, that's
the
not what I'm doing. But
the rush
the
to get to the
hypocrisy.
second shirt and then do the public presentation with the second shirt that still had the visible creases because it had just come out of the packaging. Like I don't know how you get any more peak Calgary Stampede than look, my cowboy shirt still has creases in it.
No, it happens to everybody. But the narrative the far right's trying to run right now is fascinating to watch. It really is.
That's fair.
It truly is. They're trying to manipulate the media, and like he changed his voice. He's wearing contacts now. He's, but at the end of the day, are we going to buy into this? I have questions. I know I won't, but they're just assuming, and especially like the female voter base will be dumb enough
I
to
think
be
you
like,
also have to
oh,
take a look at the source of that argument though, because like
oh yeah, but I spoke to other people as well, and it's kind of the living argument right now in the background as well. Yeah, that guy is super cringe, super cringe.
not saying,
Like
just saying.
he needs to find a new hobby. But it has been a fascinating week. There's a lot of stuff. I was keeping an. I don't know if you remember last summer when True North dragged a hair in the mud because she attended the Ismaili breakfast
Yep.
and called her liberal. I'm still waiting on True North to call all of the UCP ministers liberals because they were at the Ismaili breakfast yesterday morning. It's just the false equivalencies are just absolutely fascinating. And the hypocrisy is hitting like a new low.
Oh, I don't know if you were listening in when I did my little Ezra Levant the Rebel rant there, but
Yeah, I've been listening to the whole thing.
it is like I don't know how Ezra. I mean, he said he's not a reporter, and as one not a journalist to another. I mean, I play with puppets and I still have standards, and I don't know how he can say, "Oh, what they did wasn't journalism," and Margaret Trussler exonerated you. You must feel like, how could you ever take the CBC seriously again? And it's like, dude, the Rebel is the same outlet that literally. I've seen the screen capture, and I went back and actually verified it, and I remembered it, but I was like, but was it really? And they did like the 10 things that one of their pundits on the Rebel platform through the Rebel Twitter said the 10 things that I hate about is Israel.
Yeah.
The 10 thing and the others the tweet was actually the 10 things that I hate about Jews. And so like I don't know how Ezra gets to claim the moral high ground on determining what is or isn't journalism in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Because, like, I mean, he
But see,
testified in court that he's not.
it's fascinating because I've been taking for the past, I would say 6 to 7 weeks. I have other mandates that do not involve politics per se. That I've been working on. Like I was in London a month ago. I went travel, work with great people. But what has been fascinating to watch is that from afar, is that there is no bottom.
Oh, there's totally not. And
There's the bottom that we had. The bar was so low that now it's not even a fucking thing anymore.
that's the
There's
thing
no
that
bar anymore. It's been buried.
that's the problem that I think that we have to contend with the most is that we have a political party that has now been in power for 2 terms that
Yeah.
has openly said we just have no standards whatsoever. We're going to do whatever's best for us. And if we get caught, we're just going to lie about it later. So hope you're okay with that, everybody. And we saw in this election more people said, well, I might not be okay with that. But the reality is that that's where we are right now. So when it comes to questions of, hey, I mean, we tweeted out a thing earlier today where we got a tip from a fairly
Yeah.
not inconsequential source that they're lining up the shot to put Madhu in as the deputy minister in 6 months once his cool off time is finished.
Well, have you noticed Shandro's tweet yesterday?
I did.
That I have questions. More than one.
But I suspect that Chandro's not building that. Like my prediction would be Chandro's not building that for a government role. He's building that more
Yeah.
for a business role. And there are already rumors
Yeah.
circulating that his good buddy Mr. Kenny and maybe the Voldemort is already setting him up with a board position with a major international company.
Oh,
So
somewhere. Chandro is the kind of guy that's going to be taken care of,
yeah,
right? Minister, well, Madhu, on the other hand, is a whole different story. Absolutely different. Chandro managed to kind of save his butt towards the end. But one of the problems that we're facing too is that the opposition sucks right now. And I don't know. I don't know how to wake them up anymore. I really don't. We have not seen a whole lot of Rachel recently. Probably they got the memo. We've seen a lot of Shannon Phillips though. So that's going to be interesting to watch, to see what is going to happen on that side. But from what I'm seeing from the opposition right now is that they have learned nothing from the campaign.
well, it's like that.
Absolutely nothing.
I when I saw the letter come out from the small business
Oh,
critic,
good
being like,
God.
I wrote Chrystia Freeland directly, and I bet one of her aides is probably going to read it too. It was just such a it was so obviously performative and profile building, and in no way actually trying to represent small business owners, that it was just like, man, y'all aren't even trying. When are you going to start trying?
It's going to be a lot of swing and misses for a while. Um, unless they start cleaning the house and really trying to change things, I don't think we're going to really see things change. Because from what we've seen so far, they're not willing to make any changes inside the house. So the same problems will keep repeating themselves, right? So we'll see what's going to happen, but it's going to be interesting.
I think, yeah, I keep going back to the there's that old curse, may you live in interesting times, and I think that we're going to get a no shortage of interesting going on for the next little while.
Now, maybe I'll be back, taking a break from politics right now, but maybe I'll stop by.
There we go.
My husband's listening right now.
The spaces
Because,
is always open.
I have not seen him in like a month. So, I barely see the kids and my husband. But, anyways, you take care.
Yeah, you
Let's talk in a week or two, see if something happens. Let's keep watching.
Absolutely.
I'll come back and whine.
Perfect. Well, thanks for popping in, Sarah, and I hope you feel better soon.
Talk to you later.
All right.
Bye.
All right, we're going to bring in Tammy now. Tammy is a longtime speaker for the show as well. So, Tammy, what's going on tonight?
Oh, goodness gracious. Polyev and his. Okay, I'm a sci-fi fan, so we do a thing called cosplay.
Okay.
I don't know if he was cosplaying somebody from Wham or cosplaying a cowboy, but either way, he was doing it really, really poorly. And like,
I heard somebody say Bono. They were
Bono.
they thought he was trying to do Bono.
Yeah, Bono would fit. Yeah. Is this gonna? I don't know where he's thinking. Like, maybe he's not. But do you really think the kind of folk in Alberta that support Polyev are not looking at him and going, "Holy crap, he's all the nasty expletives that these kind of guys normally use about gay guys and cross dressers," because honestly, they react that way when we dress up as Star Wars characters or as Mr. Spock with our ears on. They think we're all morons. So
Star Trek to me has always been like a highest ideals kind of thing.
I don't get it. I really don't. I mean, people compare it going, "Oh well, Trudeau looked like a normal kind of urban family man hanging out in his best shirt." It was, he's not a cowboy. He's all boots and no saddle. But and I can say that honestly because up until my second stroke, I was still riding my horse, so I'm allowed. But I'd believe Trudeau on a horse before I'd believe Polyev on a horse. Honestly, I looked at the way he was sitting in that saddle and I was kind of going, "Oh, I hope they got a really nice Taman for him," because, yeah, yeah. So that was my thing on Polyev, and then of course my stroke has taken the second thing that I wanted to talk about was a Danielle Smith thing. And of course, I try to block Danielle Smith from my mind as much as possible, but I don't know. Sometimes I look at it and go, as it's the thing I've said with all of the lying and the hiding and all of that stuff. It's the thing that as a kid, that my parents said, and that I said as I got older. at least back in the old days of the Conservative Party in Alberta, you didn't like what they were doing all the time, but you didn't worry that they were like literally almost out to get you. And now they just don't care. They've got them, everybody. It feels like they've got so many people wrapped around their finger that now they know they can do whatever the heck they want to do, and they'll get away with it.
Yep, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I take a look at even back in the Redford days.
Yeah.
There were some definitely exploitive things that happened, and there was definitely some abuses of power that happened. But there was like none of this just every day gaslighting Albertans.
Yep, because that's all they do now. It's like we have a group that gets together of friends that get together on Monday nights, and we're doing sci-fi things. We're playing video games. We're playing role-playing games. You know, I'm an old sci-fi. There used to be a place in Edmonton, or a house in Edmonton, and it was called oh shoot, my brain is not, well, we called it a slam shack. Everybody there was either sci-fi fans or fantasy fans, and most of them were university students, and we'd all get together and do really just goofy things, you know, hang out. But I get together with my group now, and I can't help it. I start going politics, and the guy across from me, Bill, goes, "No." And I'm like, but he's like, "No, we're here to have fun, not talk about the insane place we all live." And I'm like, he goes, "I'll come next week and we can do the bitch session about it." But
That's
right now,
though.
we're here to just have fun.
It's important to be able to have those spaces where you do just have fun. And I mean, like we talk about on the show all the time, we talk about the importance of making sure that you're having these conversations with people, and it's absolutely true. But at the same time, the self-care piece and the making sure that you're still enjoying life is critically important. I have a cheesy little above ground pool in my backyard, and I spent a good hour and a half last night just sitting on this floaty that was slowly deflating and just loving life. And you have to be able to do stuff like that. It's important.
Yeah.
I believe that.
Yeah, it is. It is really important, especially, I mean, I'm lucky. And I've said that 100 times, and you probably heard it say me 100 times, because as a disabled person, I lucked out. I literally did not lose my work skills except for the speaking part. And I was able to find a company, and I get so annoyed with people. "Well, you could have found a company in Alberta." No, I really couldn't. They weren't interested in hiring me because all they could see was the disability. I tried to get a job with a company in Alberta. It was a company in Ontario that recognized, holy crap, this girl has got, 20 some odd years of experience and is switching jobs, and she knows her crap. It took a week for me to get employed. But I look at the stuff that goes on in Alberta, and I'm like, yeah, they gave the disabled folks in Alberta a handout, but I worry about them. I worry about the people that I made friends with when I was further down.
Well, I think there's good
pile.
reason to worry. And I mean, I not to correct you, I always kind of grimace a little bit when I hear handout, because I really am a big believer that the measure of any society is how well they treat and care for their most vulnerable.
Absolutely.
And so the increases are good, and like we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, the federal increases and the federal supports that are going to be coming in, as long as the province doesn't do any clawbacks on them, those will be good things too. But there's still so much better that we could be doing.
There is.
So yeah,
There is. And I don't trust, like everybody says, oh well, they've promised. How long does a UCP promise last?
like I don't know. I feel like we talked fairly in depth tonight about the Rebel Media interview and the straight up lies that were foisted during the course of that interview, and lies that were allowed to go unchallenged or were amplified by the premier of the province. So like I feel like there's a good reason to look at a lot of the people who are involved with the government or leading the government and go, I don't know if I should believe you at face value.
I know. I agree. And I look at those people. I look at those. I'm going to call them a faction. Those folk that support them, and I am not. And this might be going off on a side tangent, but I'm not Christian. I'm a Wiccan. But when I look at them, and they're always pushing these Christian values stuff. Well, one of major Christian values, not being a Christian, but having studied and read and everything else, is charity and taking care of people. But yet they seem to think, and I've said it to other folk before, that charity is literally you make sure they have a Christmas dinner, and the rest of the days of the year, do they care?
Yeah. You're not wrong, Tammy. Anything else you want to throw into the mix?
Nope, that was it. You guys have a great night, and we'll probably meet again next week.
Sounds good. You have a good week. Stay safe. This is the spiel part. I'm gonna clear the room a little bit. Got to make a couple of announcements. We have a episode coming up that I'm really excited for, where we speak with Jonathan Luscombe, who is the organizer of the Lacombe Pride Society. Jonathan is one of the people who has been sort of at the forefront at the whole conversation around the formerly UCP candidate who said the horrifying things about trans kids, Jennifer Johnson. But he's got some good things that are going on in Lacombe. So we wanted to sit down, get his side of the story, get an update as to where things are, because Jonathan and the Lacombe Pride Society have been going out of their way to try to organize a meeting with Jennifer Johnson with let's go with varied success. And by varied, I mean the meeting hasn't happened yet. But it's a really good conversation. And then on Sunday, we actually won't be doing a live show next Sunday for a bunch of different reasons, but we do have a special little treat that we're going to be putting out on Sunday. A little while ago, we sat down with another podcast out of Eastern Canada. We're building bridges here. It's kind of what we do. The 905er. And we're going to be presenting a conversation with the 905er on Sunday. We will be back the week after for a live show, but this gives you a little bit of a break from having to listen to the live shows. And we also have a couple of other interviews lined up we're very excited about. We're going to be having some chats with, allegedly, we're going to be setting up a chat with at least one leader of an Alberta provincial political party. We're going to be having, if we can make the schedules align, we're going to be talking in the coming weeks about the Alberta curriculum, because we haven't heard a whole lot about where the curriculum implementation is and where it's going. We've got a new education minister in the province of Alberta. God help us. And so we're going to be having some conversations about the curriculum. We're also going to be having conversations. There's a little aside. There's a little thing I got interested in. And oh, look, Ziad's here, so we'll bring Ziad in at the very end. But one of the other conversations that I got interested in, this whole carbon capture, this whole carbon reduction. What does it mean? What is it actually? How does it work? And is it maybe one of the biggest missed political opportunities of the last provincial election? I have had a couple of conversations with a couple of folks, and it kind of leads me to say, yeah, I think it kind of might have been. I think we might have whiffed the ball on there because maybe we didn't think that Albertans were sharp enough to understand it. But we're going to be having hopefully a conversation with Markham Hislop about that, as well as a series that he's doing on the rather problematic state of oil and gas in Alberta. So we got lots of stuff we got lined up. It's going to be a busy little summer because we're expecting that when the legislature goes back into session, we're going to have no shortage of things to talk about. And so, yeah, there's lots going on. Lots going on. And we're going to get the last little, the comments of we're going to wrap up the evening with longtime commentator and blood pressure raiser, the incomparable one and only Ziad Fazal. Ziad, what's going on tonight, my friend?
Hi, Nate. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I was able to listen to most of your spaces live. I had to rewind a bit and catch up because I was busy at the beginning. I have lots going on over the summer as well. As you know, there were some things that I was discussing with you that I had to stop discussing publicly because I was doing things under the scenes from a regulatory and a law enforcement side. And so there'll be a few more things that I'm doing there that may become public without me going on a breakdown, but may become public because of that sort of work I'm doing. Yeah, over the next month or so, some information may become public related to emails being sent to the Justice Department and involving a matter that I was in. And yeah, there's not much I can say about that other than it will likely be in the news, and it likely involves a legal matter. And I'm looking forward to dealing with it.
Looking forward to chatting about that once it breaks and you're allowed to.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, very much so.
That's like saying
There's
M. Night
some.
Shyamalan has a new movie coming out, but we're not going to tell you anything about it.
Yeah, yeah. I have to be careful what I say about it. It involves some wrongdoing and involves some communication with the Justice Ministry official that should not have occurred or should not have been portrayed the way it was. So I'll leave it there. And I think some of you know, over the last couple of months, I've had both my mom die in March and then my dad die in June. And so I've been a little bit low key, but their deaths allow me a little bit more freedom in being able to pursue regulatory matters and law enforcement matters without having to also chase my monthly bills or work for my monthly bills as well. So I might be a more effective advocate over the next couple of months because of the freedom being given to some of my time as a result of my parents passing and leaving me a little bit of savings to live on while I pursue some important work that's 70% done or 80% done and is half finished. You know, some of the things that we've discussed on your show that I then couldn't continue to discuss because I had regulatory work that I had to finish.
Very cool.
So yeah, maybe that's my M. Night Shyamalan voice. I don't know what he sounds like, but there's some mystery going on, and I look forward to resolving the mystery when matters become public.
Excellent. Well, anything, as always, any way that we can lend support or provide you a platform, you know where to find us, man.
Thank you. Yeah, some of these matters are a little intricate, might take a little bit longer to explain, and you've always been great about giving me the forum to make longer explanations. You know, when I'm making sense and I have the evidence behind me. So,
you still there, Zach?
yeah, I mean, I'm saying that you've always been good about giving me time to make a longer explanation when I'm making sense and I have the evidence behind me. So I look forward to doing that when I'm in a position to do so.
Awesome. Looking forward to hear about it. Thanks, man.
You're welcome, Nate.
All right. And that didn't raise my blood pressure. That was just a nice little teaser conversation with Ziad. So that's a new experience. That's kind of fun. I think that wraps up our list of speakers, and I think that wraps up our content for the evening. So I'm going to go ahead and do the obligatory plug. As always, one of the reasons why we're able to produce the content that we do is because the support that we get from our wonderful Patreon supporters, and you too can be one of those wonderful Patreon supporters by signing up at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for the price of just a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to do the things that we do. I'm such a bad salesperson. But in all seriousness, I want to say a big thank you to everybody who is signed up on our Patreon page. I know there's a lot of people who can't afford it, and they try to support us by listening and retweeting and liking and sharing and writing reviews on the podcast, all of that stuff. I want to say a big thank you to everybody who does that. Huge thank you to our comments section tonight. Good to see a lot of the regulars kicking around in there. I say it every show, but I do love the comment section that shows up, and I love the little environment that you guys have created in there. It's absolutely fantastic. Big thank you to all of our speakers tonight. Good to hear from Sarah Biggs for the first time in a long time, and hopefully the health stuffs resolve themselves soon. All of that being said, everybody, it's Stampede in Calgary. If you're in Calgary, drive a little bit extra safer, and try to show a little bit extra patience, because there's certainly some patience challenging folks that are out there. It's like the worst episode of Halloween that just goes on for 10 days, but the mini donuts are good. So do with that what you will. That's it for this episode of The Breakdown. Take care of yourselves. Pay attention to what's going on, because, like, honestly, I thought that this was going to be a not very eventful week, and yet here we are coming up to 2 hours. So there's going to be lots that's going on. You can, as always, follow us on the Twitter machine. We're now on the Threads. We're on the Instagram and the Facebook, and occasionally we post videos to TikTok, but we don't pay any attention to what goes on over there. So don't look for interaction there, I guess is what I'm saying. In the meantime, and in between time, look for our interview conversation with Jonathan dropping on Wednesday. That'll be up for all of our Patreon sponsors tomorrow. And we will see you live again in 2 weeks. In the meantime, keep the conversation going.